Welcome everyone to the start of the afternoon session for the MD&M conference here. I don't know if you've heard me speak before at MD&M. I've spoken a few times and happened to have talked last year about the new ISO 14971 changes. And then this year, just in discussions with the conference, it's like, well, what have we learned basically since it got released? And so I've actually had the opportunity to work with a number of organizations, training-wise and procedural-wise. We'll talk a little bit about that, but so that's kind of where this comes from. So there's a baseline, and I have references at the end. There's a baseline presentation from last year that kind of gives some of the basics of the standard, and today is really drilling into a couple of those areas. Ever have questions? I always say it's a small community, so don't ever be afraid to reach out. I got my email, my Twitter, and my mobile number, so a lot of ways to get in touch. But I'm always open to that as need be for folks to help, because a lot of times if it's I'll call it a simple, quick question, I always do that for free. And if I'm curious, I go longer. And so sometimes curious can be an hour or two. So just don't ever be bashful. So again, I already kind of gave the background, but I spoke about risk management last year here. I've actually applied risk management in the aerospace, auto, defense, and medical device industries as part of my career, but then also consulted in, I think, all of those except for the defense world since over the last 17 years. And the last bullet is just saying what I already told you about, just being able to apply this and see the challenge areas within several organizations. So my goal is to bring kind of the common themes to you today. And I sometimes, lessons learned, I don't know if we've learned all the lessons, but at least some points of emphasis to be aware of. And if you do have questions as I'm going through, don't be afraid to throw those out. I'll leave some time at the end, but also want to, kind of address them as they come up, just so you're not overly concerned with that as we're doing new stuff. So the 5 main areas that I want to talk about today, the risk plan, the management review, and the management report, or the risk report. Those are 2 things that, again, I talked about last year, but there's a few subtleties within those. But then what's the impact on all of the new changes on suppliers, on your existing products? And if you're familiar with the standard P1, P2 approach, raise your hand if you understand what I mean by P1, P2 approach. And it's okay if you don't. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get into that section, but that's an area of a lot of confusion right now. So start with the first category, the risk plan. And I kind of broke this into two portions. First one is just the expectations that are part of the risk plan. They're a little bit new or extended compared to before. So the first bullet's talking about that risk activities need to be defined, it's just asked for in the standard, by life cycle phase for all new products. And on the surface, that sounds pretty easy. You just put that in your procedure. We'll do this at all phases, and the plan will say we'll do it at all phases. But why is that maybe a little bit cumbersome in the real world? If we prefer to start risk management process at the concept level or very early stage of development, before we have a parts list or a defined manufacturing process, how do we do that? Most of our FMEA as a tool is based on their bill of materials from a mechanical or electrical point of view. But if those don't exist, how do we do it? Well, the second sub-bullet there, we can use functions or components, but you have to make sure that your wording, your procedures, basically, and training encourage that and allow that. So instead of saying that you have a particular part, this is going to be leverage the opening of a door or something like that. Or in a manufacturing process, instead of welding, it might be joining. Joining is the function. It's maybe not the actual process step, because we don't know if we're going to weld it or solder it or some other function, but they will be joined at some point. So using functions, but it's a different mindset. When you start thinking functions instead of components, Just people need to be comfortable with that, and your procedures need to allow it. It can't be boxed into the component space. The other challenge with doing things early is a lot of procedures, again, are written for assuming you have a lot of information. But if you're at the concept stage, you don't have any test data, any field data. So how do you do your probability rankings? So you need to make sure that because your rankings are going to tend to be qualitative early on instead of quantitative, that your procedures have wording to allow both qualitative and quantitative rankings. Then as you begin testing and get a little bit more information, then you can add the data. Responsibilities for each activity. Again, if you're early stage, it might be different, as you go through the phases. So I found some of those responsibilities for activities. It certainly can get vague of who the leaders are. Is it really a design person, a marketing type person? I'm thinking more like for usability, FMEAs. Who's really responsible for that? Some of these activities have been done before, but who actually does them? We know the information exists, but who's that group, and is that the right group? So it's an opportunity to review some of that. And I've seen challenges with understanding the responsibilities for all the different things that are included in risk management. And then the requirements for the risk review is expected in our risk plans, the expected data and information sources, and then again, the roles within that. The challenge with that kind of from this lessons learned point of view, the expected data and information sources, be careful about saying more than you're actually going to do. Are you going to do every component and every process at your facility and at every supplier? Well, that sounds good on the surface, but every supplier, how far do you go in supply chain in those kind of questions? So be careful of saying the minimum, and then if you need to dig deeper because of higher risks, then to allow that. But if you force yourself to go deep, equally deep at all levels across the board, your design, your process, you end up creating a lot of wasted documentation, focus and drill down only in the high risk areas. And again, the challenge here is the requirements in the risk plan. If you do less than the plan, FDA tends to frown on that. They're going to at least drill and ask you questions. So if you kind of say the minimum and you dug in because there's a high risk, they're going to be okay with more. But deciding to do less often is a sign that you're behind schedule, not that there is good technical logic for it. And the criteria for risk acceptability kind of comes back into that quantitative, qualitative concern. But you need to have that in there. And I'm finding that organizations, for whatever reason, are using the standard change as an opportunity to change their rating system, which means their acceptability levels change, which means there's no traceability history going forward. My own personal recommendation is don't change those things. Try and keep that consistent. But for some reason, I'm seeing a lot of organizations make changes in both areas. And then there's process things within the risk plan. And I think it's important that these, not just that they're considered, but understanding the impacts of these changes. So it talks about the need for a method to evaluate the overall residual risk and acceptable level. Well, that ends up being performed in the management report and signed off there. Well, does whoever sign it off, are they involved in that process? We may have a process we believe upfront from a quality or risk organization or design project management organization, depending upon the responsibility. But the person signing that off better be familiar with the process. And often it means that they need to be involved maybe more deeply in design reviews and stuff leading up to the final signing of the report. One of the other things, again, the risk plan is to talk about your method to verify that the risk control measures are effective. And I left a question mark up there on purpose because I hear the default is, well, we're going to validate it. That's probably not the only thing you're doing. And again, to communicate that and make that clear, there's probably in-process development data reviews that are happening. There might be manufacturing inspection steps so we can confirm that it's sustainable. So there's probably more than just a simple validation answer that I kind of felt as a default for organizations. The risk plan needs to talk about the collection and review of production and post-production data. It's a big change in the standard. And what I found in manufacturing and clinical data, not so tough, but in the field of return data or competitor data, yeah, someone does that. I'm not really sure who. I don't know what they look at, and it's kind of a black hole. And so I've seen some procedures where they list everything. Well, now you're signing up to do everything. But also people aren't sure who to talk to and if there's maybe redundancies in doing that work. So have some, again, up front, understand if who's responsible, what data sources are you for sure going to do. Again, you can always do more, but be careful of signing up for too much early. And obviously, I flag in here that the approver of the risk management report is expected in the plan. And the main reason I flag it here is a trigger is if they're going to sign it off, they better know what's in the plan because they have to sign off on a lot more things than they used to be responsible for. So now we're going to talk about the risk report. There's team things, again, for point of emphasis. Again, reviewing the residual risk, that needs to be done. Usually by the team, it's not necessarily the management sign-off. Benefit risk analysis has always kind of been done. It's kind of been done a little bit separate. They're basically forcing it always to be integrated now. But the big shift is now it's to the state of the art, not just your best, but what's the state of the art out there from a risk point of view to the patient. So the fact it's no longer just your own product. It's the design engineer within your firm may not be the person that understands the state of the art as well as maybe some other people. So again, part of that, who's responsible for it, who needs to be involved, can really change in writing that section. There's a kind of a checkbox that says that that you've ensured that all risks have been considered and actions completed. That's a huge black hole if you really think about all the documents behind the risk management process. How do you link maybe several different FMEAs, design, process, usability, suppliers, internal, and that every activity's been checked off? You know, that's hard. A lot of people are putting in their templates. But again, it's not so much that a protocol and a report will be generated, but some of the characterization work, which might be part of the learning that we don't even need to validate at the same level as we thought originally because the risks aren't as bad as we first anticipated. So how do you know that you've considered them all and that you've completed all the actions? That's a black hole. Just the way to track that, and this is where I say it's not a lesson learned, because I think it's a point of emphasis that there's probably going to be a hole. You're probably not going to. How did you validate this one? I don't remember because there's just so much involved. So it's a pretty deep area. So that's more team activities. The team's got to realize someone's going to sign this off at that level. So our ability to track and show report numbers or whatever traceability back is real helpful for our risk activity. And from a management point of view, management needs to quote unquote, check the box that the risk plan's been implemented. Well, it means they better understand what's in the risk plan and what's happened through the development project. That the overall residual risk is acceptable and again has been reviewed. So all the data, all the reports, all the information that's been generated, it basically pulls that all together and that it's acceptable. Again, it's a management sign-off checking that box. So that's a big deal. And then similar to what we've talked about in the plan, but methods are in place to collect and review the production and post-production data. So I talked about there's a lot of sources. Not everyone always knows who's actually collecting that data, but they know it's available to them. Well, there's got to be a process for frequency and again, sources and review and what do we do about it, whether it's vendor changes, change in the state of the art, all those different little tangents that were already mentioned in the plan. If any of those change, are we reviewing this 6 months, 12 months? And again, reporting from vendors and other sources. So just understanding that those methods are there, and again, it's ultimately management responsibility that the details of that are logical and not asking for too much. And again, if you'd like to do it quarterly, but you know you might back down, you might only require it annually, you could still do it more. But be careful of, again, committing for too much, because I've seen in multiple organizations, we're going to look at this risk information during development. We're going to look at this every 2 months. Well, then all of a sudden 2 months happen and there was a hold on the project for resource needs or something else. So you get to the next risk review meeting. Well, we've kind of been on hold, so you skipped the meeting. Well, now you didn't really technically check the box that you had them every 2 months. So just, again, be careful on those frequency expectations. So that's kind of stuff I would call embedded in the standard, and talked about at a high level last year, and again, it's kind of that points of emphasis this year based on what I've observed at companies. Now, a couple of things that are kind of beyond the standard, but still kind of get triggered because of it. What about suppliers to your organization? They've always kind of been part of the process, but years ago, they used to be kind of an invisible part of the process. Now they have been for many years part of the audit process. Well, now there's more pushing on supplier involvement in the risk management process as well. So how do you get your suppliers engaged in this? Again, this is something I've talked to organizations about. They're like, wow, I don't know, they need to do it. And it's like, well, they do things that cost you money. So how do you, and you have to know that you've triggered them to do the right things. And there's probably other vehicles for this, but the most generic one that I've talked to folks about is flowing those expectations through a supplier quality agreement. There's a lot of other things they have to do. Make sure your risk management up-to-date needs are part of that. Because again, if there's an annual review because the state-of-the-art changes or other things that could be changing, your suppliers need to be part of that, potentially need to be part of that process as well. So there needs to be hooks to keep them involved. I think it also becomes a consideration if we're working on something that's maybe a low volume need, they probably don't have a lot of fluff in their profits or in their financial system to just to kindly do that for you. So how we kind of take existing products that maybe haven't been built for a while for a new order, or if we have multiple suppliers, we haven't ordered from them for a while. So how do we get those expectations in there and be part of a regular system? Because suppliers tend to work for obviously a large number of customers. I think as a customer, you need to be very flexible with your own format. So make sure your procedures are giving them the ability to use whatever template makes the most sense for them, because there's a good chance that their risk information, I picked on welding earlier, but that joining process, a welding process, your supplier may use their risk information multiple places, multiple customers. So be flexible as an individual customer to make sure not drive them. If you have a particular column that's mandated for some reason with no flexibility, then all of a sudden you became a lot more costly of a customer. And I give you some of this because of the auto industry. The auto industry, I won't even start to say the years, but the big three automakers created a guidance document for all the automotive suppliers so they could follow one system. And medical hasn't gotten to that point yet. So we throw out a standard, but with open templates. And so if the templates don't comply for whatever reason, we got to make sure that that we can handle that from a customer end. Hugely, because the patients are involved here, in the medical device world, you got to really prepare to be involved. Again, if you're using a supplier template and it doesn't quite match yours, but some of those traceability things for your reports, did all risk activities get completed? Were they satisfactory, and so on? You want to be involved to make sure you can check those boxes with confidence, not just say they took care of it and be hands off. And then again, particularly because of severity impact on patients, a supplier is not going to know all their customers' patients. So you need to be be able to be involved at that level, not just hand it off and expect a document back in the door. Some organizations kind of are that way, very hands-off, and let the suppliers just drive the process. And in the final thing, I kind of already hinted to it, but the expectations for risk management should depend upon the risk level. If there's a component from the supplier that's low risk for you, you don't have to derive a whole lot of information back from them. But if it's high risk, you certainly, FDA would expect it, patients would expect it. So we need to make sure that we're doing that from our customer side to our suppliers. But again, vary based on risk level. And this is from my defense life, but one of the things that I basically learned there, one of the inefficiencies in product development in the defense world was driving all of our risk management, all of our tracking, everything, all to the same level. If you're a project manager, down at the same WBS level for everything, regardless of risk level. Drive it down deeper for high risk, keep it higher for lower risk. And I forget what the percentage of cost impact that makes, but it's pretty drastic. So more with suppliers. This is more from the supplier side. Some of their key activities. As a supplier, what's your method to ensure compliance, not just to standard, but to all your customers' expectations? And again, if your customers are pretty flexible, it's a lot easier. But if customer A wants this template and customer B wants that template, how do you keep track of that and make sure your rev control and everything else is up to speed? Certainly complex. So how do you stay on top of that? Huge is a practical process to execute risk management, regardless of your level in the supply chain, tends to not be fun for people. As a project manager, I loved it because it got me resources, it got me visibility, got me people, got me money. But still, you don't want to just do things that are wasteful or not practical. So how can you make it it's easy to execute and yet getting the value at the same time? And one of the things I've kind of hinted at this is it's a welding process. Your welding process, key failure modes and so on, may be very common independent of your customer. So I think you can write these kind of process-focused versus customer-focused documents to leverage and keep it practical to create, but also to update. And if there's some variations, find some flexible ways to consider the expectation, or exceptions, I should say. How do you consider the expectation exceptions from customer A versus customer B? And again, it depends upon the variety of customer bases you have. I've used this example a lot with the catheter world. It doesn't really matter how long they are, what the diameter is. They're pretty similar. So you could do kind of a family, from a design point of view and a process point of view. You could do a family document that covers a lot of different product numbers instead of one piece of paper for each part number. The third bullet, again, kind of danced around this one a little bit already. But knowing that you need to have a method to maintain the accuracy of these process FMEAs over time, including the state-of-the-art. And so that's kind of one of the new challenges that really wasn't talked about with risk before. So how are suppliers knowing how they relate to that? And again, if it's a patient therapy type state-of-the-art, how that kind of flows back to you. So it's again where the customers need to be involved as part of that process, but it's the awareness that could always be things to trigger you. And this last bullet is something, as I was putting these slides together, I was actually asked by a client, so I figured it's a great thing to add to this particular slide. It says, do we need a hazard analysis for vendor changes? And I looked at him and I paused for a few seconds. I just said, yes. He says, well, what if it's not a big deal? Well, you probably know it's not a big deal because you already have one. And so you can go back and look at the hazard analysis and say, it's not a big deal because it already is covered on line item 17. So do you need a new one is a different question. But if you've already done a good hazard analysis, then you go back and say which line this change fits under and why it's no big deal, then it's already done. And if you can't, if it's not an easy answer, well, then obviously you need to add line 18 to your risk management documentation, because this is something that a change has happened that triggers new risks and blah, blah, blah. That's all in the standard. So I think the simple answer to the, do you need a hazard analysis for vendor changes? The simple answer is yes. Here's another thing that organizations are facing is, how do we handle existing products that we developed under an old process and an old template? So the first obvious question is, when do we update the old product to the new format or the new template? You don't want to just automatically go change everything. What if you never build it again? Or what if it's low volume? Or what if it's just stable and never has any changes? State-of-the-art could change. So you could have a state-of-the-art review, but you don't necessarily have to create brand new documentation. So just what's your criteria for when to update existing products? And again, I already mentioned, I've seen a lot of organizations change their scoring methods, which I personally don't recommend for a variety of reasons. But if you do change your scoring method, what's the impact of that new scoring system on your old documentation, on your existing products? If your new scoring system makes an old low risk now a medium risk, you create a red flag that never existed before. So any changes to scoring systems have the opportunity to open up a can of worms that you really don't want to open up. I addressed this in the previous section. But what's the impact on suppliers? So you have an existing product without a supplier quality agreement that includes some of this risk management stuff. But now you have an annual update. There's a change in state of the art. How do you get your suppliers engaged on your existing products, not just new ones, but on your existing? And the fourth bullet here, and again, I kind of said it based on the title. We call this lessons learned, but really it's points of emphasis, because the solutions to a lot of the questions that companies ask, the answers certainly vary depending upon your situation, your history, and your current processes. So I would argue standard answers really don't exist, because I was working with two clients at the same time, and they asked me similar questions, and my direction for each was unique, just because their situations were so different. And then the last thing, just to keep you aware, and this is one of the challenges I think FDA has, there's as many risk templates as there are companies I've worked with. I don't think I've ever seen the same template used more than once. There's always some subtle difference. So this is part of the rationale for kind of being nice to your suppliers. If every customer asks for their own template, I promise you there's not going to be a lot of overlap, and it's going to be really complicated for them. So there's no consistent processes, there's no consistent templates, which also means it's a challenge at FDA to review risk management stuff. And then I added a little sub-bullet. I also haven't found any good software to help with some of the risk management. FMEAs in particular is what I was thinking of here. So the P1, P2 approach. We did the hand raise earlier, and not a lot of people are familiar with it, so let me briefly explain that without a slide to back it up. The P1, P2 approach is basically an occurrence rating that's discussed in the standard, not required in the standard, but discussed in the standard. And there's a little bit more background in last year's presentation about this, so if you want a little bit more, you can go there or catch me offline as well. I'll be here after this. If you want to chat after my session. But the idea of P1, P2 for occurrence, there's two different risks or probabilities that the ISO standard is discussing. And so the first one is P2, if you're in a hazardous situation, what's the percentage chance that the patient's actually going to see that particular harm, that severity that's been identified? That's what P2 is. And then P1 is the percentage chance that that hazardous situation can exist in the first place. So if P2 may be, well, if it ever happened, the patient's going to die, but P1 might be, but it's impossible to happen. P1 is essentially 0. Well, then the overall probability is pretty low. But they've kind of split those out, and I can picture some of the logic, and I won't try and discuss or support the logic. But it breaks down what I call previous occurrence type rating into 2 different percentages. And so one of them you can get purely, I would argue, clearly from a clinical setting. The P2, if we see this, does a patient really get hurt or not? You can see that. And then P1 is kind of more from the design side or process side and how you can influence. So I can see the logic a little bit of splitting them because it's kind of different people that think about each number. You don't have to show hands because it's being videoed, but I'll raise them for you. How many of you love occurrence and it's always really precise to the 5th decimal place? I mean, we can't do that. And that's just on occurrence. So now we're going to split into 2 different numbers that are just kind of a little bit of the blinders on and hoping for the best guess. So that's kind of where this slide starts, is the concept of splitting it up. I kind of get the logic behind it, but the execution is complex because, again, we're ultimately looking, if you multiply P1 and P2 together, does that make sense? And then how it ripples through the rest of our risk management process. So concept logical, execution very complex. Every company that I've worked with trying to implement their new procedures, this is the hot point. I mean, just number one hot point of every organization is, how are we supposed to do this? And no one likes it. No one from clinical likes it. No one from engineering likes it. No one from quality likes it. It's a pain. But if we're supposed to do it, we need better guidance. We need better information. It's like, again, back to my first comment, it's splitting up. It was splitting up something that was already hard to estimate in the first place. So if you're splitting up something that's difficult, it doesn't always make it easier. And those of you familiar with the old style, I'll call the old style of FMEA or risk management, it really blends together the occurrence and detectability, which I thought were useful to separate, but it kind of blurs them into kind of one probability now. And it's not required to combine them. It's just there's ways you could do it that it wouldn't have to blur together, but I've seen, because of the ISO standard, the way it's written, it uses, I call P1, P2 logic to explain how to think about getting an occurrence value. And then companies say, well, if it's in there, I want to do that exactly in my template. And, but literally there's nowhere in the standard, because I've read it 18 times. There's nothing in there that says that you have to use the P1, P2 breakdown. But in an audit, how do you know that you're complying with the intent of it? And it's certainly easier if you look the same. But I think it makes things, I think it's an unnecessary complication. My assumption is it's going to be weakened and softened in the standard in the future. The 4th bullet, again, I've seen certain companies, because they're trying to follow the standard so closely with the P1, P2 approach. If you're performing our risk assessments early in the project at the concept stage, like we said before, the detailed information just isn't available to understand P1 or P2, frankly, occurrence in general. So you have to make sure, even if you're sold on P1, P2 is what we're going to submit to FDA at the end, you need to have something for that early stage, because you'll have no percentages. There's going to be the minor, moderate, major type risk type information from a scoring point of view. So again, part of that flexibility needs to be in your process and not mandating P1, P2. And I've I'll say I've struggled with organizations to get them to open up their procedures to allow both. It's like you can't ask for, do it early and only do P1, P2. You can't ask that at the same time. They're incompatible. But then ultimately, having qualitative and quantitative together is also hard. Again, if we have information for P2 but not for P1 yet, how do we blend that together? It's nice to use the information, but we don't have full information yet. So, or maybe we have it for severity, but we have numerical for severity, but not for occurrence. So how do we blend those together? And do our procedures make it as simple as possible to allow that? So I've allowed some time at the end for some questions. We didn't have any as we went through. A couple of references as you're thinking about questions. The first link, just the short links, is the risk management presentation from MD&M last year. The second one's an article I wrote for the MDDI magazine last year related to last year's talk. And then I have several YouTube videos, one about FMEA, one about risk management in general prior to the ISO change. Something about requirements, because a lot of risk is failure to meet requirements. Design of experiments, because it tends to be a great way to address requirements, conflicts, and get things resolved. And then the last one's just a white paper about design of experiments. So a few resources that kind of support the stuff that we've been talking about today. So questions does anyone have?
The definition of residual risk?
Yeah, residual risk is, and this is, I talked a little bit about it last year, but risk really can never go to complete zero. So there's always some level of risk. There's always some level of uncertainty that remains. Residual is just leftover risk. So once you've done all your product development and process development, what's left over risk-wise? And then the discussion is the benefit of your device with those features worth that risk that's leftover residual risk?
Yeah, I had somebody recently propose to me combining our system risk assessment into a hazard analysis and getting rid of our system risk assessment. Just curious on your thoughts on that.
So two answers. We can talk after. So that's the first answer. Because the answer I ultimately give is situational. I'll call in the old days, hazard analysis is purely patient focused and pretty high level. And that's all we used to give the FDA. And so it's something that, yeah, if it's patient related, it's fine to give it to them. Now, sometimes we've been giving, component level design FMEAs, maybe some key manufacturing process FMEAs. Now you're starting to give some of your proprietary information away. So depending upon the structure of your documentation, if your hazard analysis is patient focused and stuff you wish the whole world knew, like it's dangerous, but it could be dangerous, but it's not because we're really cool and we're really smart. You do want that information out, but the details of your design, details of your process, that to me would tend to go on a system risk. And then if they're really that separate, that's internal secrets, and keep that. An audit, you can have it, but we're not going to give it to you as submission. So depending upon how you're structured, I tend to think hazard analysis, disclose it, give it to everyone. But now I'm seeing hazard analyses bleed into not looking much different. And so I would argue simplify the hazard analysis so you could submit only that and keep a lot of the extra detail out of the hazard analysis, put it in a system or other type of document. Is that helpful? Other thoughts?
Perry, I have one. Oh, I'll come up to you, Mark, in a second. So my question is, you talked about P1, P2. Where do you stop? You talked about P1 potentially approaching zero risk of ever actually happening. Do you still record those? So where do you stop?
Yeah, so if a percentage is low enough, usually it's low enough because I like to say risk documentation, take credit for how smart you are and all the good work you did. So if something is a 0 or very low risk, yes, certainly record it. Particularly if the severity opportunity is pretty high. This could be horrible, but it's not, because we use this novel material and novel processing, and that's why patients will never see it happen, and why we're amazing and it should be the only product on the market, and you should approve us tomorrow. That's kind of the story you want to tell with RIS. But if it's 0 at this, basically 0 level risk at this level, there's no need to go back to the component suppliers and keep digging down into the depth of the product structure, if you want to think of it that way. That help?
Do many people use FMEAs?
Yes. Yeah, no, it's different than the hazard analysis. Yeah, because the user now is totally looking, whether it's a nurse, a physician, or other care provider, stuff that could happen to them, as well as the patient, and it's just a different view. And again, I think it gets in the nuts and bolts of why you do things a certain way, maybe how you've designed an app or some of your software interfaces. So I think it really can get, the true use information can get into a level of resolution that really is company proprietary. And just to expand on that a little bit, because I don't see another hand and I see 2 minutes. The organization I worked with recently, they certainly split them up. And yeah, that use thing, now you can come in and talk to doctors, and you can have in there, Dr. such and such said, because it's your document, not being published to the FDA. And as soon as you publish to FDA, not saying, they're not trying to give it away to everyone else, but it's still in their head. If it's in their head and they're having conversations, they can allude to stuff that maybe you don't want them to allude to, that you're starting to work on, if you're having those communications early.